In the downtown east side of Vancouver, in 12 years of work, having dealt with hundreds of addicted people, I never met a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. If you work with addictions, hardcore addicts who are female, those who had not been sexually abused will be a minority. And sexual abuse shows up in how the brain looks 15, 20 years later. All the men I had dealt with in the downtown east side had been abused sexually or in other ways. The minority sexually, but in other ways for sure. That was my particular experience and observation. That would also be anybody's experience and observation if you ask the right questions. But we're not even trained to ask these questions. And it's astonishing to me how many addiction specialists never ask about any depth about what happened to you in childhood. It just doesn't come up. And yet these are the factors that shape the personality and the brain. Now if you look at the large-scale studies, so I'll ask you a question now. Raise your hand if you're familiar with, not just have heard about, but are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies. Okay, so we got about, do we have a fifth of the people here? Fifth to a quarter? Okay, good, thank you. Which, and you must hear this not as any kind of a criticism of you personally. It's an instant photograph of the system. Here I'm talking to an audience of people who work with addictions, who are committed to helping addicts, or who may have your own issues yourselves, and you've never heard of the most important studies ever done. But that's the nature of the system. These studies were done in California, Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, ACE. For God's sakes, look them up this evening. An adverse childhood experience is physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, violence in the family, a parent dying, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being jailed, neglect, a divorce. For each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. They multiply each other, so that by the time a male child has 6 of them, his risk of becoming an injection-dependent substance addict is 4,600% greater than that of a child with no such experiences, a 46-fold increase. Why? A, these experiences interfere with the proper development of the brain, obviously. B, they give you the emotional pain, discomfort with yourself, the emptiness that you're trying to escape. The title of my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. The hungry ghosts are, it's a Buddhist image of these creatures that have large empty bellies and small mouths and narrow gullets, and they can never fill themselves. They have to keep trying to get something from the outside, but they can never feel fulfilled. That's the addict. That sense of emptiness comes out of a childhood experience where emotionally you weren't satiated when you needed to be. When you have negative experiences as a child, there's a deep sense of shame. If you're sexually abused or otherwise abused, or just not paid attention to the way you needed to be, you're going to feel ashamed of yourself. Why? Because the child can only assume that there's something wrong with him or her. Children are narcissists. And I don't mean in a negative way, I mean I'm just describing a reality. In a sense, they really believe fundamentally that it's all about them. So when something goes wrong, the assumption the child makes is that it's something wrong with me, so hence the shame. So there's a deep shame in addicts long before they were addicted. That shame is core. When you're treated that way early in life, you know, the Buddha said that with our minds we create the world, which is true. The way you see the world is how you're going to act in the world. If you see the world as a benign place where, you know, you can expect respect and human contact, you're going to be one way. If you believe that the world is a horrible place, you're going to act another way. And you're going to live in a world then based on that assumption. A man who said that the world is a horrible place is not the President of the United States, because he had a horrible childhood. His father was a raging workaholic. His brother died of alcoholism. And this man learned that the world is a dangerous place. And that's where he's coming from. I'm not talking about politics here. I'm not talking about policies. You can agree or not agree with any political platform or any perspective or policy. I certainly am not in a position to, well, I am, but I'm not going to, comment on any of that. I'm talking about how the personality is formed and how it shows up in the world. And if you think that caregivers who are supposed to look after you don't, then what's going to be your attitude towards caregivers later on? One of suspicion and distrust. Why should it be any other way? So these are the impacts of trauma. I'm going to finish here by saying that I'm not saying that everybody who is traumatized becomes an addict. That's not true. But I am saying that everybody who's addicted was traumatized. If we understand that trauma does not have to be overt, so there's the big T trauma, such as these abuses that I mentioned, and statistically they're highly present in the addicted population, particularly in the substance-addicted population, but also in sex addiction. Most women who are sex addicts were sexually abused as children. Many people with eating disorders were sexually abused as children. But it doesn't have to be that, you see, because as the great British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott pointed out, two things can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't happen. But the other is when things don't happen that should happen. My children were not abused. Not that I was free of rage or acting out behaviors, but there was certainly no abuse in any meaningful sense of the word. But what was lacking is that responsiveness, because I was a workaholic. Now, why was I a workaholic? Because in my infancy, as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary in 1944, I got the message that I wasn't wanted. Because under those conditions, my mother was so unhappy and stressed. I don't have to tell you the family history. You can imagine it. When the mother is unhappy and stressed, the infant believes, she doesn't want me. If she did, she'd be happy. And then, when I'm a year old, 72 years ago now, this month, she gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life, thinking that she might not live. The message I got is I wasn't wanted. Now, if you're not wanted, a great way to deal with the sense of not being wanted is to go to medical school. Because now they're going to want you all the time. Except they're not going to want you. It's never satiating. Why is it not satiating? Because we have to be wanted for who we are, not for what we do. If we're only wanted for what we do, there's a nagging sense. If they really knew who I was, well, they don't really care about that. They just want what I can give them. But it's the next best thing. So if I can get wanted by going to bed with a lot of people, then that's what I'll do. Even though it doesn't satisfy that core need to be wanted, because that needs to be for the self, not for the body. So, hence the workaholism. At the time the beeper went, it was the validation that I was wanted. But of course, it would never satiate. What message do my kids get when daddy's not around all the time? This is how we pass it on from one generation to the next. So it does not take overt trauma, but it does take emotional loss and pain in childhood. So for all these reasons, psychological and neurobiological, as modulated by the environment, this is how addictions develop. This is the essence of addiction. And in treating addiction, this is what they have to take on. It's not by accident that in both your country and in mine, the populations most addicted, most alcoholic, most despondent, most suicidal are who? The Aboriginal people, who you call the American Indians, we call First Nations peoples, who are so severely traumatized by history. It's not accidental. These are people that had substances here in North America, but they were never addicted. They were never addicted before the coming of the Caucasians and the trauma that befell them. In short, addiction is not a choice. It's not a genetic disease. And in some level, even though it acts like a disease, and it's useful to think of it that way, fundamentally, it's not a disease at all. It's a complex response. In fact, it's a very normal response to abnormal circumstances. And if we're going to help addicts, we have to get at the core of their pain and help them deal with it in different ways.